Hello and welcome to the Deadbeat Philosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Dave Baumeister. Today on the pod, I'm very happy to have my buddy, Dan Thomas. Dan's an American stranded in Germany, just like myself, but he lives in Bayreuth, across the country from where I live in Stuttgart. Dan is a wissenschaftlicher Mitarbeiter at the University of Bayreuth in the Institute of Biology, Chemistry, and Geosciences. Dan and I covered a lot of interesting ground with regards to mushrooms, bacteria, life sciences, biology, environmentalism, the boundary between the human and the non-human natural world, and talked a good amount about Dan's research on fungus, the fungus among us. So I think you're going to really enjoy this one. It's one you're not going to want to miss. So enjoy this chat with Dan Thomas on Deadbeat Philosophy. Biologist, mycologist, father, friend, husband, a lot of son, a lot of things in life. So Dan, how you doing, dude?
Yeah, I'm good, David. It's good to see you. We don't do this often enough.
That's right. That's right. Although we're both American guys stranded in Germany. We both have German spouses, and so we actually see each other. We live on opposite sides of the country, but we see each other in person more often than I think a lot of people do.
Yeah, maybe it's because we're both the expat thing draws us together. Maybe I don't know.
Exactly. There's like a certain I don't know if it's a double-edged sword, like we're together in sorrow and in joy, but mostly joy, right? So
yeah.
Tell us about where you live, and what do you do there, and just give us a snapshot of your life.
So I live in the town of Bayreuth, and so I work at the University of Bayreuth. Bayreuth's mostly famous for the controversial opera composer, I guess, Wagner. Flight of the Valkyries, da 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 da. So this was where he lived, and it's technically in Bavaria, but the people here prefer to say that they're in a region called Franken,
which is where Frankenstein comes from, I believe.
Is that right?
No, I don't think
I've wondered about that, but I can't find any reason why Mary Shelley picked here. But yeah, sure, could be. It's an interesting region, has a lot of local pride, and I think it's the best beer in Germany, which makes it the best beer in the world.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think that has a good claim to being like the best beer region. And just like the variety of different beers. I mean, there's, other regions have their something to speak for them as well. But every beer I've had from Franken and from the Fränkische Schweiz has just been fantastic. And so actually, last time you guys came to visit, you brought a case, which was like really incredible. And there's actually still a few bottles of that I've been saving on the balcony, like that have especially interesting labels. I'm hoping that those ones, they're also just very, very charming in how they're decorated and things. So it's nice to be in a place. And I think maybe as Americans here, like we can appreciate some of those things, the novelty of them, maybe more than the natives.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's funny that American beer has gone full cycle where it used to have a lot of really, I guess you might call them wholesome beers with a lot of body, a lot of taste, a lot of regional differences. Then they got heavily corporatized. And then you have that sort of microbrew movement in the US that's, in the last 30 years has tried to reclaim the good flavor and good flavors, unique flavors, local flavors. And I think what they're trying to be is kind of exactly what we have here in Franken. There's a brewery every small town, not every small town, but a lot of small towns have their own brewery that's been there for 500 years and tastes unique and different. And so I kind of think what the American microbrew movement is trying to be is what we have right here in Franken. And so I love the beer. We could do a podcast just on beer.
Yeah, we should do one. Like we're both meeting during the day right here. So we're in the same time zone, but we could do one at night where we like taste the beers and discuss them as we go, see how many beers we can get in. But in any case, I want to ask you some questions related to philosophy, biology, mushrooms, forests, any of that stuff. So you are a you have your PhD in biology, and you work in a lab at Uni Bayreuth. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about what you do there, but maybe just give us an overview of your angle on that field. And I know, and we should also talk about your environmental activism, and we can talk about Ecuador and things, and so where the conversation might go. But maybe just spin us into how, like your angle in that profession, and we'll go from there.
Yeah. I guess, so let's start with where I work. I work at a particular institute called BICER, so the Bayreuth Institute for, Environment and Ecological Research. It's
a catchy name.
Yeah, BICER rolls off the tongue. So it's an environmental ecological research institute, and then I work in the microbiology part of that. So the ecological microbiology chair, as we say in Germany, kind of like a small department. So fungi, some people don't know that fungi are microorganisms, mostly, actually. People like to think of fungi as mushrooms, which they are. I mean, let's say mushrooms are fungi, but the vast majority of fungi actually that are out there in nature doing their thing, you can't see. They're because they're microscopic. So, yeah. So my specialty, I guess, developed during my PhD. I originally wanted to study fungi because of mushrooms. I liked mushrooms. I'm a hippie. I go in the woods and look for mushrooms.
Yes, like eating them. If you find one big enough, you like sitting on it. Like the caterpillar in Alice in Wonderland.
Yeah, it brings clarity of thought. But all kinds of mushrooms. But I quickly learned, like most of us, that the real action for a lot of mycology is microscopic. You can't really understand fungi without bringing in the microscopes and the DNA sequencing technologies, so you can see basically what's invisible to the normal eye. And once you do that, you realize fungi are everywhere. I mean, you can take the dust off your table. I'm not saying you have dust, but if you
there's a lot of dust around here. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, if you just kind of wipe it up with your finger, you're taking up fungi. You're taking up a lot of bacteria, but you're also taking up fungi with you. Tons of fungal spores, probably living fungal hyphae. They are everywhere. And then when you go out to where I'm really interested in the forested systems, it gets, the fungal diversity is out of control. I mean, you can pick up a leaf and you're picking up 200 species or more of fungi in it or on it that you just can't see because they're so small.
Incredible.
That's the kind of fungi I study.
So it's people say the fungus among us, and I suppose that seems quite true. Like it's literally among us. I don't know. What do you think of that phrase?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know why it was coined, but it's absolutely true. I mean, every breath you take in, you've probably breathed in, a couple hundred fungal spores, just a guess, right? So
yeah.
They are everywhere, and they're an important part of our microbiomes too. Most of the time when people talk about our microbes, they're talking about bacteria, but we have really important fungal components. And they can make us healthy or they can make us sick. But they're definitely there and they're active.
Yeah. So in some sense, like we're part fungus, in the way, I guess maybe our genome or our microbiome, we require those fungi. And I like that idea, I suppose that's in environmental philosophy or environmental theory, ecology and such, like understanding the individual as a networked with other living beings always. And maybe microbiology in particular allows us to understand that interwovenness.
I mean, we even say, so you got it right with the microbiome, right? They're an important part of our microbiome. And then we have the term, not our genome, but our metagenome, the shared genetic resources of us and our microbiome, right?
Okay, going meta.
There is the argument that we're superorganisms, right? That we're sharing genetic resources in a way. It's not a perfect. There are problems with that argument, but There's definitely something we call the metagenome, which is like all the genetic resources of us and all of our microbes, including fungi.
Okay. Yeah, and I suppose it's like who do you identify as is one of these questions. It's like, are you just maybe then just your genome, or are you also your metagenome? And like, what should you care about? What do you need? What should you what do you have ethical relationships with? What really matters? All that comes into plays there too.
I mean, think about when how much your mood changes when you're sick. I mean, you can be barely conscious. You can be miserable. You can be like, your consciousness changes when you're sick.
Yeah, I usually like getting sick. It depends if you get to like stay home. If I'm sick, but my like kids are healthy and are in school or whatnot, then I'm actually in a very good spirit. But I see what you mean. I get your point.
I mean, it depends on if you have something good to read or watch. But if you're absolutely physically miserable, I would say your consciousness
depends on the severity. Like, absolutely, yeah.
You know, things like ulcers; those are microbially mediated, right? And they're painful beyond belief, right? And like I would say, so that's just one argument to say that your consciousness changes when your microbes change, because like ideally you have this balanced, whatever that means, a sort of balanced microbiome that's helping to outcompete disease organisms, maybe even actively fight them off sometimes. And as soon as that changes, you can enter into a miserable state where you're just in a lot of pain, and that's microbes. And then there's even like, I mean, there's some evidence out there, it's mostly in mice, but it applies to humans probably, that there is direct influence on your, that gut brain nerve axis is probably being directly manipulated by microbes. So your mood, your hunger pangs, that's, I mean, potentially, at least partially, microbially mediated, right?
That's wild. Yeah. So and so much of what we then construe as our like lived experience, and just like our day-to-day way of sensing and being in the world, then it's not just us. If that thesis holds, but even just recognizing it to a lesser extent is already, I think, pretty radical. And I wonder, well, let me spin this in the direction, like speak about, so at your institute, what work are you working on now? Or what is your sort of angle within microbiology and related to fungi? Where do you go more narrowly within that?
Yeah, so I like to be in the forest, in the woods. That's how I got started on all this. And what I'm really fascinated by is how microbes move, what I call fluxes, the movements among, especially in forests, studying some other systems, but how interconnected all the different parts of the forest are. Let's say we just talked about how there's plants, or I don't know if we talked about this. Plants have their own microbiome, just like us, right? So they're covered in fungi, covered in bacteria, and they're actually internally, like just in and out, inside the wood, inside the leaves, really just saturated with microbes. And my research, we do a lot of things, but one of the things that really interests me is how important is it? What are the connections between the microbes that are living in the canopies of the forest with the microbes that are living in the soil? Also, how does that affect the soils? They hold about twice the amount of carbon, we think, as is available in the atmosphere, right? So when you think of like climate change, global warming, we're always worried about the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. Well, if you think in terms of total carbon, it's mostly in the soil.
Okay. Just like on a planetary basis.
Yeah, right. And so you can kind of think of that as like a good thing, because that carbon's not going into the atmosphere right now. It's not accelerating the warming process. You can also think of it as sort of a powder keg that we're sitting on, right? Because that stuff can get released very easily. You can degrade your soils, through different kinds of agriculture, land use, whatever, and release that carbon.
Okay.
So like it happens a lot with deep.
If the soil is really disturbed, is kind of not healthy, or is maybe not how it originally was? Like, yeah, or maybe you mentioned, you were about to mention deforestation there. Could you give us an example of how, of like
Yeah.
a land use that releases carbon
Well, I
in the
mean,
soil?
right now there's a lot of discussion about the role of tropical forests and their release of carbon to the atmosphere. It seems to be very dynamic. Sometimes they're taking it up, sometimes they're releasing it. That's all mediated directly or indirectly by microbes, right? They're the ones that are going to decide the fate of this carbon in the soil. Deforestation is pretty well documented. You get these massive releases of CO2 because when you deforest, you almost inevitably you degrade the soil in some way. You expose it to oxygen. You allow microbes, heterotrophic microbes, to access to carbon that they haven't seen in hundreds, sometimes thousands of years. This carbon is tucked away and protected in the soil. Then you disturb the soil structure, expose it to oxygen. You typically get a quick surge of CO2 whenever you deforest into the atmosphere. And all of those, the microbes are in the middle there, right? They're the ones that are quickly converting that carbon that was stuck in there for hundreds or thousands of years, and they're respiring it and turning into CO2 and releasing it to the atmosphere. So one of the main projects that I've been working on, it's finishing up now, is trying to sort of predict that, right? Like, how do these we don't deal with deforestation, but we deal with different land uses. Does farming, for instance, encourage or discourage this process of release of CO2 from the soils, or conversely, fixation of CO2 back into the soils? So, and then my part in that project especially is trying to figure out the role of the forest. It seems like forests stabilize a lot of carbon. And I'm trying to figure out why, and what aspects of the forest are important for that. Why is it that microbes in forests don't, shall we say, release as much CO2 into the atmosphere as they do on a farm or in a field, basically?
Okay,
that's one of my projects right now.
Great, yeah, so you do field work in, correct me if I'm wrong, but in the Fichtelgebirge, the part of the mountains near Bayreuth, and the forests up there. But it seems that some of the points you're aiming to make, if generalized, could apply to forests overall, kind of in general. So do you say a little bit more about these forests, and what about them maybe is unique, or just say a little bit more.
Well, I mean, Germany is kind of fascinating because it's not like the U.S. Everything is dynamic, right? Except for a few heavily protected forests. Things can really change. In the U.S., you can get a clear cut still, in a lot of national forests. You can quickly you can get a shopping mall where there was a farm, a year before. It's very dynamic in the U.S. And in Germany, you have these. Some might call them antiquated, let's just say older land management laws that go back hundreds of years, where a field is a field, right? The king, they don't have kings, but someone declared it a field.
Yeah. Back when there were kings,
and
for the most part, exactly.
Yeah, let's say, or a forest is a forest, right? You can stumble over the little boundary blocks that are hundreds of years old, and they're like, oh, this is the Duke's forest. I'm making this up a little bit, but the zonation of the land is a lot more stable here. So you have forests that have been managed for timber for hundreds of years. You have a field that's been a field for hundreds of years, and same with the farmland. Those are sort of the three basic classifications, right? The farmland, field, and forest, and it's hard to change them, right? So that's to me, really interesting system to study, right? It's these forests here, they're in the U.S. we have a lot of old growth, or we have more old growth. They're just, forests are wild and crazy, complex systems. Here, they're pretty much timber production systems. Like there's some exceptions, but mostly they don't allow trees to lie on the ground and rot. They're removed if they die, if they fall over. They're harvested on very regular schedules. The canopies are fairly simple compared to the ones that I'm used to in like the old growth in the Pacific Northwest. You don't see these complex, multi-layered old forests. You see, good solid German production forests.
Mm-hmm.
And okay, that's not very romantic, but what it allows us to do a little bit is kind of isolate. It really makes you think, what is a forest?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like what this, some people might just call it a tree farm, but maybe we can call it a forest. It simplifies things down just to the basics.
Mm-hmm.
A canopy with some trunks, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I can ask questions. My research used to be in, say, Oregon or in Ecuador. Here I can ask the same questions, and we've sort of pared down and simplified the system.
Mm-hmm.
Do we just need a canopy? Is that enough to this phenomena of forests protecting their carbon? What are the bare bones of that structurally to make that work?
There are fewer variables, right, to have to try to take into account.
It's a simpler system. I mean, they really don't let complex forests here. They don't let forests be. When a tree, they usually cut trees before they fall, and if they do fall, they haul them right out. The farmers or the owners are obliged to go in there and pull it out.
Okay.
And
what do you think of that practice, just as an aside? Because I know, or maybe with regards to wildfire and things, there's a lot of controversy in the U.S. or discussions, particularly in California, about forest management and how over clearing of felled trees and things, disrupts natural fire cycles and leads to, Germany doesn't have as much problem with wildfire for now. Do you have any thoughts on, whether, but it seems that, given the centuries of history of that management, that in a way, kind of the proof's in the pudding a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question of time, and it's a question of what you want from your forests, right? I mean, I'm a hippie. Like I fell in love with mushrooms and forests, and so when I go to the old growth in Oregon, the ones that haven't burned, it's like going to church, man. Those old trees, there's something about them. Now that's hard to quantify. That's hard to tell someone in LA whose house is on fire that it's worth, my sense of sacred around forests is usually not enough to justify keeping those trees just to keep them. Usually with humans, you have to say, okay, they're providing this service, they're providing this value. But so just to say where I'm coming from, like I think an old forest is a sacred and beautiful thing. So it was kind of hard for me when I came to Germany and to see these forests where there's very little complexity, very little structural complexity, very few old trees. The old trees are suspect. You have to watch them for beetles or whatever. And so I'm not one to make prescriptions. I think there's inherent value in old forest. There's something priceless about it. So it approaches what we would call ecological complexity in our fields, where you just get a lot of nonlinear feedbacks, a lot of complexity creates complexity, and you get these emergent properties of very beautiful things, but it's really difficult to quantify. And it's much easier to say, well, you should manage the fuel load in forests so you don't get, so you can reduce the chance of wildfire, things like that. From that angle, the German forests are perfect. They're timber production machines. They have low risk of wildfire even during drought, although there is some. I would say that they are very well managed.
At least now.
It's maybe not.
I know. Like you've probably looked a bit into the history, or I know I've been to some like forestry museums, or I guess down in the Black Forest in particular. But I know in that region, it's interesting to learn the history and how in the late medieval period, like early modern period, in the like 13, 14, 1500s, the Black Forest was basically just chopped down. And later, like in German industrialization, it was like very unsustainably cleared back then, because the logs were just trimmed and then put on the Rhine, and then they were sold up or downstream, and eventually into the North Sea for all the ship production, and all those trees went and were exported all over the globe, but in particular around Europe, just for a huge boom of building. So much so that it kind of laid waste to the landscape and to ended up ruining the economy. I mean, people were just stepping on their own feet there with that. But it's interesting that that lesson was learned, it seems. And I mean, now people in the Black Forest take a lot of pride, but it is important to note that it's not, an old growth forest. And that is an interesting thing with, or I mean, I guess there are pockets that are old growth there, but it's not, most of the Black Forest has been cleared to various extents. But that this notion of wilderness, because being an American as well, we have wilderness areas and national parks, and we conceive of them as wilderness. Of course, in environmental philosophy and ethics, the concept of wilderness is a bit fraught insofar as, what does that mean? Does that mean nobody's lived there before? What about indigenous peoples? What does it mean for there to be a human impact on a space? But I see what you mean about a forest, in particular, an old growth forest, let's say like something like a wild space, having intrinsic value, having something sacred to it, having just something worthwhile and appealing. And then it's interesting to be in Germany and just to think about Europe overall. There's very little wilderness in the American sense. I mean, I think in Lithuania and in parts of the Baltics, there is what we'd consider old growth, but not in Germany. So what does that do to your whole concept of nature and the human's place in it? I don't know. Do you think about that stuff too?
Well, yeah, definitely. I mean, I've often asked myself, like, what is wilderness? It's kind of a vague term, right? But one biologist term, I forget who it was. Anyway, there was someone proposed a definition, which was that wilderness might be where evolution is unguided, right? So that, like, if you say take those German forests, for instance, they're historically, this is changing, and that's another important topic. But historically, they grew what we might call Norway spruce, Picea abies, or Picea abies, if you're German. And that's a super straight. It's a conifer, it's a spruce tree, and it's super straight. It grows one trunk straight, tall, quick growing. It took over. I say it took over, but Germans planted it all over their country. I think maybe 800 years ago. I'm sort of but
maybe that connects with that Black Forest stuff. I mean, because those are good to be felled and to be processed into timber, right? So,
right, and they grow rapidly. They make good fuel. They were used for all kinds of industry at the time, and so that we're living with the legacy of that. The reason I bring those up is they're just you can think of every German forest as heavily managed, and even sort of evolution itself, you could argue, is being controlled because the provenance, the origin of all those trees there is known, right? Like foresters, they control sort of the genomes of the plants that they use, of the tree species they select. They know they've been bred for certain characteristics. They entrust that breeding to nurseries a lot of the time. There's a lot of wild spruce now, but when they replant, they use known provenance, trees with known genetic, shall we say, they have certain traits that are highly encouraged, that are bred for, right? And so, in a sense, humans have sort of taken over. That's what, by that earlier definition, it's not a wild system, because if those trees start evolving traits that are not desirable, they're going to get removed, right? I mean, to an extreme, same with the game species, the deer or whatever. So it's like, as much in these systems, there's not a lot of wilderness, right? And then by this definition of wilderness, where we let evolution do its own thing, there's a lot of that in the U.S. There's regions of the U.S. or large tracts of forest where we even let it burn and see what happens. Just let it see what happens. It's not necessarily a question of, are there a lot of people there? Is there? It's that we're letting the system sort of decide for itself where it goes genetically,
but still not without human input. And it's interesting here to like the concept of the Anthropocene, the human era, the human geological epoch, and the premise of that idea is that the planet as a whole has entered a new period where the human impact is basically inescapable and pervasive. And so there is that question, are there even wildernesses anymore if human activity and traces of human things are basically physically present almost everywhere? I mean, even in the depths of the ocean, there's microplastics, and certainly in terms of human impacts on the climate, that has almost universal impact. I mean, I suppose there are probably plenty of microbiomes. You might make a case like some cave dwelling, like microbiomes inside some volcanic cavities, maybe like escape that. Or maybe like on the moon or other planets, but humans are racing out there. So in other words, like, have humans touched everything so that there is no pure non-human impacted evolution anymore? Or maybe it's just a spectrum.
Well, I mean, it's so notice you and I use two different terms, right? You use impact or touch, and I use control, right? So I would argue there's a wilderness in every gram of soil. As a microbiologist, I can't predict what's going to be in there. I can make some educated guesses, right? But we spend a lot of money and time trying to figure out what's going on genetically with the microbes of just 1 gram of soil, right? So a microbiologist sees wilderness, by my definition, where humans, maybe we impact, but we don't control, right? I would say, like, I mean, we're still learning a lot about it, but the civilizations in the Amazon turned out to be really sophisticated, right? All the LiDAR that's uncovering these just vast cities in the Amazon. I would even say I don't know how they lived, but you could maybe say there was a component of wilderness in a place where there were a lot of people. The reason I say that is I don't know if they took total control of the forest where they lived, like, they obviously had some impact. Some people think that's why there's so many edible plants in the Amazon. But I can imagine, I bring it up because I can imagine systems where humans are there in plenty, in density, right? But it's still what I would say a little bit wild, because there's a certain inherent creativity to these old complex systems that we can't yet really emulate, right? One of the things humans do is greatly simplify the systems they live in if they try and control
streamline things. You go from squiggly lines to straight lines, right?
Yeah, and lots of lines to fewer lines, right? Like in the case of agriculture, we go from a wild field with its own set of flora to the 3 crops we want to grow on it at most, right? So and so I'm just saying, like, if you can kind of make that distinction between, yes, we're impacting everything. It's crazy. I mean, there's nowhere untouched by humans, but we're not really controlling evolution in all those systems. I would say we're controlling it in, like, with macroorganisms, big things. I'm a microbiologist, so I think small. We don't have control over microbiological evolution at all. It wreaks havoc on our hospitals. Think about staph, the antibiotic resistant strains of bacteria. They're evolving all the time. We have very little control over it, and it affects our lives, right? And that's a wild system to me, right? We're trying to control it, but we haven't. And then if you scale up to forests, like I wouldn't call the forests here in Germany that wild, because we have strict control over their evolution. And in the Western US, where we have this big tracts of old growth forest, I would call that wild, because those trees might come up with genetic innovation that we have nothing to do with. They will with time. Right?
And, that brings for me the idea of balance and of control and lack of control. And I was thinking earlier with what you were saying with regards to just fungi and their, penetration into our living systems, to the extent that we are and depend on fungi in our own bodies and in the world around us, that then seems like there's a certain healthy balance to be struck. And maybe here too, with regards to wilderness, with regards to control and lack of control, there's maybe a healthy balance to be struck. Insofar as, I guess one could argue that if they're going to be humans, some degree of control over any number of processes is what humans are going to do. And, humans can justify that control for their, allowing them to sustain their society, which could be better or worse. But if you imagine, like, let's say, a good society that we agree ought to have the right to sustain itself, then some degree of control is needed. But there's a lot of overreach in the history of human control, enormous, and where we are now as a planet. I mean, it feels that things in some ways politically are getting worse in terms of opening the floodgates for allowing more of that control. But I think what you've been saying there points us also to this idea that part of it is just letting go of control, is what we need to do. But let's take a quick break, and then we'll come right back. And we're back. So we're here with Dan Thomas. So let's keep chatting. Dan, we were just talking about soils, about balance, about microbiomes, about control in wilderness. And I'd like to invite you to talk about those topics, if you'd like, in connection with a specific place, and that's Ecuador. So I know you have a relationship with Ecuador, and maybe just like sketch for us out what that relationship is and spin it out in this direction.
Yeah, let me see. So when I got started late in life with academia, before that I was just working as basically a field botanist with the Forest Service in the U.S.
That's cool.
But at some point, yeah, it was a cool job. Not a lot of security, but at some point,
but a lot of time spent in the forest.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, that's why I did it. Right. Mm-hmm. Ecuador came along in the form of I had traveled to Ecuador in the off season of my work and loved it, but I'd only ever really been to Quito, and then I met when I was living in Eugene, Oregon, where I met you. Mm-hmm. I also met a professor, Dr. Biddy Roy, who had a project in the cloud forest in the Andes of northern Ecuador, and it just sounded so cool. And so I went to go talk to her, and one thing led to another, and I went down to Ecuador with this professor, with Biddy, in 2012. I think Christmas of like 2012, Christmas of 2011, beginning of 2012, I think. Anyways, she was doing a project on orchids and mushrooms that orchids mimic mushrooms to attract flies. She found out to act as pollinators. It was a really cool project. So I volunteered with her, went down to Ecuador for a couple of weeks, and basically just counted flies on mushrooms and counted flies on orchids, and that was a really cool project. From there, though, the reserve that I worked at as a volunteer with her, where we did our research, kind of roped me in because the place is just so amazing. It's if anyone's traveling to that region of the world, go see Reserva Los Cedros. Reserva Los Cedros it's a really beautiful spot, and lots of us kind of got pulled into its orbits because it's so magical there that we just we help out how we can. We go when we can. I have a feeling it'll be an important part of my life for the rest of my life, mm-hmm. even though I don't live in Ecuador. There's a network of people that really help the place along, protect it,
and it's open to the public
legally.
Insofar as if people do travel to Ecuador, you can schedule a visit or check it out with your own.
Yeah, mm-hmm. And you definitely, check out reservaloscedros.org. It's a very remote place, so that's part of the appeal. Mm-hmm. As the crow flies, it's not very far from Quito. It's less than 100 kilometers. It might be more like 50 from Quito in a straight line, but it'll take you all day and sometimes 2 days to get there from Quito. Mm-hmm. And the last part of the journey is often on mules because it's up on a mountain. And it's is only access either on foot or by mule.
Do you have when you've been, do you walk beside the mule or do you ride on a mule?
You have your choice. A lot of people aren't comfortable on the mules because they're the mules are awesome, right? I love them, but they sometimes people get dumped or they get brushed off if the mules don't notice a branch, and so it's an adventure. But they're tame. You can ride them. They'll if you request it, they'll put a saddle on one for you. Mostly they're there to carry heavy cargo, though.
Sure.
They don't usually carry saddles.
They're pack mules,
and,
as it were. The
right.
the long occupation of mules the world over. So.
Yeah, they're amazing creatures. I never knew how amazing mules were until I came to this place. Like, oh my gosh, they're way more reliable than horses. They don't get sick.
Okay.
They work like crazy. I don't know. Anyway, that's a whole nother.
But
topic.
they got the speed of a horse, but the patience of a donkey, or yeah. I mean, I guess it is another topic, but
yeah, they're not that fast, but they're very steady. Very steady. I mean, I've seen them go in like meter deep mud where you don't hit solid ground until you about a meter. They'll work their way through it one step at a time. Like just I've seen them hike things that scared me. Like so, I have an amazing. I have an appreciation for these amazing animals, and also the culture around them. In the Andes, they were so important. Like it's disappearing because of roads and coming in everywhere. But at least in this region around Los Cedros, there was a whole culture around mules. Like that was just they have competitions. The local people, I mean, they're kind of like a Renaissance fest. You might picture where they're running mules really fast, trying to hit targets with sticks and stuff.
Like jousting, anyway. Like jousting on the mules.
Yeah,
that's cool.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
So it's a whole culture in the region where they can't get cars in, right? Where the roads aren't stable enough, where you can't really, in that region, there's so many landslides and it's so steep that it's hard to build roads that last, right? So
yes.
But so mules were really important.
Yes, and okay, and it sounds very appreciated. So, and that even just those details say something, I think, about maybe the ecology and the human ecology of a place, and living in a certain harmony with the non-human. And in this case, these mules, you might say they're pack animals. They're certainly domesticated, but it's from what you're describing, they perform a very valuable service and are appreciated for that. But
yeah,
would you,
and all that to say,
yeah,
basically it's a very remote place.
Yes,
it's a remote place where mules get you there. Reserve of Los Cedros is very remote. Mules get you there more reliably than cars. Cars don't come close to the place.
Okay, so yeah, tell us what's up at Los Cedros itself once you've gotten there with mule. What do you do, or what do you see, and what have you done?
Well, I mean, what you see there is you see ancient cloud forest that's never really been cut. There was indigenous occupation of these forests. No one really knows how dense, but when they were there, I'm blanking now on the name of the indigenous group. The Yuma? I'm not sure. I'd have to look it up, but there's archaeological traces of these people, and it's clear that they were there. There's still some living ancestors that got moved, but they didn't remove the canopy, and no one knows how heavily they modified the forest. But anyway, these are forests where there hasn't been massive alterations in human history, as far as we know, for thousands of years at least. Right? It's too wet for fires. Like there's not. It's a place that gets 3 to 4 meters of rain a year.
A real rainforest, cloud rainforest. Okay.
Yeah, or a cloud forest. It's raining a lot, and then you're also often in fog. Basically, there's it's not permanent. It lifts, it changes, but there's a fog belt that occupies that zone, and it's very primeval. It hasn't been cut, right? So it's hard to describe. We get back to that sort of undescribability of these ancient forests, but it trips the same nerves, the same reactions in you. It's just a really magical place, and it's hard to describe why. And the one thing you can point out is that it's very old forest. I mean, the cloud forest in itself it doesn't matter if it's old or young, is a really mysterious kind of forest, right? It's really cool. But then when you add to the fact that this place is thousands of years old, and there's still there's regions of the reserve that humans haven't been in 200 years probably, or longer, several hundred years. So it's according to our previous discussion, very wild place.
Great. And so that has a lot I mean, then that wildness is reflected in the microbiology of the place as well. Is that when you've been there? I mean, it sounds with that research trip that brought you there, that was your
Yeah.
focus.
Yeah, I mean, we just put out a paper. I was only a minor part of it, but it's a good paper about the fungi of that place. And so that's what I know. If I was more of a bacteriologist, I could tell you more about the bacteria, but the fungi there, it's you trip over new species. Like they're just I would say when you go out into that forest and you see a macrofungus, like a mushroom or some other structure, and there's always a really good chance that it's a new species.
Okay, and then you'll get to name it after
20%.
after Dan Thomas Issis microbiome fungus.
I don't
know how that works.
I think there's some ethical.
You can't name it after yourself.
I think, and we have more qualified people who handle the taxonomy and the naming.
Sure.
But usually, it gets named after like someone's favorite professor or something.
Okay.
Yeah, but I mean, I think there was a discovery of a new psilocybin mushroom there, or maybe it was just the second time it had ever been observed. No, I think it was new there, just a couple of years ago.
Okay.
Just as an example, there's in places like that, you're reminded how incredibly like wilderness equals creativity. Like there's a whole lot of new species there that are really charismatic. That if they were in Central Park, people would be like, ooh, but it's hidden away in this place and only just now being discovered.
Yeah, probably. To their benefit, I suppose. Like remoteness protects wild spaces as well, and or can.
And that's just the ones we can see, right? That's the ones you can see that form mushrooms or other structures. And now, if you ask me about the microbial diversity, it's out, it's out of this world. You can't identify half of what you find there. Right. There's just
now let's pivot and speak about staying in Ecuador. Tell us about the politics of the Los Cedros and how that maybe connects to the ecology and the microbiology for you.
Yeah, okay. So, man,
to the extent that you'd like to, it's probably it's a big nut.
Yeah,
right
no, it's. Well, it all comes together, right? The science and the politics and the environmental struggles. So it's not as simple. Obviously, it never is, but it's a very complex picture in Ecuador. With all the electronic devices that we have, our laptops, our cell phones, and now especially electric cars, electric vehicles, there's a huge demand for copper and other metals, right? But copper as a conductor is still the basic. We haven't, even though we haven't superseded it as what we put in our wires to carry current for us. And so there's a huge demand for copper, especially now with electric cars. It's sort of, the new gold, right? It turns out that this region in the Andes where Los Cedros is there's a lot of copper. It's been, mining has to happen, but for me, it's sad that it was found there. There are massive copper lodes and other metals. Under Los Cedros, there's a copper molybdenum mix. Maybe nobody knows because we've stopped exploration there for the moment. But Los Cedros sits in the middle of what they now call the Andean Copper Belt. That makes Los Cedros, what do the mining companies call it? An overburden. That makes this ageless, thousands of year old forest. It makes it overburdened on top of some valuable minerals potentially, and so there's a lot of pressure now, to remove that overburden and get to what's underneath.
Okay, and there's many mining concerns, and I imagine it's very complicated in terms of the corporate interests, probably the governmental entities, because there's tax revenue that comes from that mining and such. So, but at the same time, a lot of cross purposes in terms of the land and what's actually valuable there. Do you, so like you say for now, exploration has been halted, and are you optimistic about how that might hold going into the future?
I mean, it's anyone's guess. So what happens, I guess, just for the people who might watch this, the international mining corporations are all over that area. Starting not quite 10 years ago, there was this massive sort of backdoor deal between, no one knows the details because it was so secret, but in Ecuador, I think something like 20%, maybe more. We ran the numbers once, I forget. It's at least 20%. It might be closer to 30. Basically went up for sale in Ecuador. The Ecuadorian government realized what it was sitting on. This Andean copper belt kind of wealth was waiting for them. And so they sold without any consultation to the country, to the people of the country. They sold so mineral rights in a way to the highest bidders. We don't even actually know if they were the highest bidders. They do these claims just appeared overnight, and where international mining companies claim the right to explore a certain piece of territory, something around 20% of the country or more. What happened therefore was that Los Cedros overnight, without any warning, ended up on a piece of territory where a Canadian mining company had the rights to go in and do exploratory drilling. No consultation, no vote, nothing. Los Cedros itself is theoretically protected by the state. It's a bosque protector, which is a kind of legal protection on a place. It was specifically protected against mining, but it didn't seem to matter. Around 2017, money talks, right? And so Los Cedros found itself in the middle of a dispute. This a mining conglomerate, a partnership between the Ecuadorian state mining company and a Canadian mining company, Cornerstone Resources. They wanted to go in and start drilling everywhere to see where the copper was to run their tests. And unfortunately, this was not something that we wanted to let happen. It's just the amount of disturbance, the amount of road building, the amount of drilling, the threat to the water was just too much. So we sort of all organized a network of Ecuadorian and international activists responded.
Okay.
With legal challenges. Yeah.
Yes. Wow. Yeah. And is correct me if I'm wrong, but in because I've read a bit about this in the news as well, or with Los Cedros, and is part of these legal challenges also rest on the idea of non-human personhood, or of treating the or of like the rights of nature. So I mean that's a whole other topic, but in terms of the legal dimension here, and with regards to wild spaces or protecting natural spaces from the capitalist encroachment and mining exploration and extractive industries, there's this legal strategy of trying to give either personhood or some sort of direct personal rights that are recognized in court and that have standing in courts of law to non-human natural spaces, entities, and to use that to some effect to make an argument within for the protection. So is something like that what happened here, or what did happen?
Yeah, it was a really important part of this process. So I'm not a lawyer. I can give you my understanding of the case. But it was, as I understand it, the first test of the Ecuadorian constitutional rights given to Pachamama, or nature, right? I think in the Constitution, in the Ecuadorian Constitution, I think it's written up as Pachamama, but that's something like we would understand like a goddess of the earth, or the presence of the earth, right? So, and I think it roughly gets translated to the rights of nature, right? Giving nature that personhood, I suppose. And that was very critical to, ultimately, there were at least 2 court cases affiliated with Los Cedros. And the final and most high profile one was at the Constitutional Court, which is something like their Supreme Court. And it was over this interpretation of this clause in their constitution that had never been tested, which was this idea that Pachamama, or nature, had rights. And we invoked it. I didn't, but people making these decisions invoked that as their legal defense. Also, that the communities had not, I believe we also reminded the courts that the communities had not been properly consulted, et cetera, et cetera. And surprisingly, it was quite a gambit, but it actually bore out. And as far as I understand, we were the first test case for this this legal personhood of nature in Ecuador, right?
Yeah.
And for that reason, it's gotten a lot of attention, as it deserves.
Totally, yeah, nationally and internationally, right? And I know I've just encountered it in the broader kind of nebulous space of environmental theory and policy disputes, and there's other cases of, I believe, rivers in New Zealand, and a number of attempts in a number of countries around the world to grant some sort of rights of nature. But so that's very interesting that it's in the Ecuadorian constitution. I mean, that's kind of a great model. Speaking, thinking ahead into the future for humans, if we're going to achieve a better relationship to non-human nature, maybe some of our constitutions and founding documents need to make a similar turn. I can't imagine that happening in the U.S. anytime soon, but maybe in a couple generations, when the planet's been more ravaged by climate change and the necessity to do this becomes more apparent to people. But I like that legal strategy.
Right. Because, I mean, there's this inherent value argument that nature is sort of, as you mentioned, his or her own, or its own person, their own person. But then you can, and this was important during the case, those of us who testified, we had to kind of bring it back a little to something less abstract. This is something I think that gets forgotten, is that, yes, nature, I'm the last person who needs to be reminded that nature has its own interest and needs to be protected. But, excuse me, just a second.
No problem.
In the end, a lot of that court case, this is my own perception of it, was, okay, nature has her own rights, but what does that mean for humans? And so a lot of what we testified about was, there's a reason to preserve this personhood. So, for instance, I testified on 2 accounts as a witness. One was this, that there is a ton of carbon stored in the soils at Los Cedros, and we tried to put a number on how valuable that carbon was. So we had to take the service approach, right, and the economic approach. Like, maybe as soon as we start paying for these carbon credits, the locals can actually really, really benefit from this. And so, and then I also made the case, as did the other scientists, that there's unimaginable genetic diversity there. There's genetic resource, like the next generation of antibiotics might come from those soils and those trees. We don't know, and we'll never know if we mow them down, right? If we just get rid of them as overburden. Like, the argument is that the genetic resources there, just from being a wild place thousands of years old with unimaginable diversity, in that is a kind of richness. I hate to make everything about money or wealth, but like, there's genetic resources there that we'll never know if we just cut it down.
Yeah, if we just disregard it as overburden. It's mere overburden. Right. So I see your point about, there's something dangerous about commodifying and quantifying and putting in with a dollar value to these, ecological services provided by these systems. But I think, for better or worse, that's necessary to break through. And there's something to be said for that. It's like those are real benefits, and those need to be highlighted. And it seems that, I mean, that example with the overburden and with the mining company, it just shows in many parts of how these extractive industries work, they just have a really overly simplified, reductive view of what non-human nature is.
Well, they can always. I mean, the thing. So the wages there, like an effective laborer who puts out his or her strong arms to do a day's work there, historically would get, like in the late 90s, early 2000s, they would get $20, maybe $30 a day, right, in that region. And then mining doubles that,
Mm-hmm.
right? They could get minimum of 40, and it goes up from there per day working in the mines in the region. So there's a lot of talk about personhood of nature and stuff, but a lot of the struggle boiled
Mm-hmm.
down to
Sure.
economics, right? Like here, the locals, they want and they need jobs, and they need to
Mm-hmm.
live with dignity, and they need some money, they need some cash money. So it was a really interesting conflict because all levels were involved, right? There's this like abstract, somewhat abstract rights of nature that really appeals to a lot of people sitting at home reading their magazines. Then there's the battle for the minds and the hearts of the local people. And it is really hard to argue with those wages, that someone there can get double what their parents
Mm-hmm.
could make if they're young and healthy and can go work in the mines, right? Like, and I found that like there's a lot of interest in the abstract rights of nature, but I found that both were occurring at the same time. And if you ignored either, it was at
Yes.
your peril. You could not ignore the economics at work there. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. And it's maybe, to hit that note of balance again, that also means having a balance between different perspectives and different levels of analysis, and to recognize how complicated these issues are. And I really appreciate talking with you, someone who has a background in the natural sciences, and me obviously coming from the humanities. But I think that the issues that we work on and care about have so much overlap, and really an approach has to be multifaceted in order to really get to the issue at hand, and especially when it comes to environmental stuff, environmental policy, environmental science, all of this. So, Dan, I want to ask you another question then, just to kind of like try to tie this up with like a neat little black bow. So this channel is called Deadbeat Philosophy right now, and one of the things I'm thinking about is big philosophical questions, big quotation marks, but one of those is a question about death and how we relate to death. And that's something I'm, as like a middle-aged dude, and I know you're also a middle-aged dude, thinking about that. So I want to ask you, just like opine, what are your views of death? Do you fear death? Do you see death? And also, as a mycologist, and where death and the recycling of life, right? Decomposition is such a huge part of the world as you understand it, I suppose. So what's your view about all that as a human being, as a specialist, as a parent, child? What's your view of death?
wow. Yeah, no, I think so. As an ecologist, it's kind of, death is a funny thing. I think we're the only, very few organisms like want to die, as far as I can tell. They try and preserve
Lemmings, right?
themselves to a
Lemmings, they
degree,
just want
but
to go right
I
over
think
that
humans,
cliff. They follow each other off. Yeah.
yeah, do what everyone else is doing. Yeah. I think humans have a particular fear of death, as far as I can see. And I think it's because we're so, we have this type of consciousness or ego, or what, I don't really know what you call it. You would know better than I, but whatever it is, that part of us that likes to play video games and argue about politics and philosophy, that part is really afraid of going away. I think it thinks it's the most important part, right? I think that's all these like futurists who really want to work on sort of digitizing your consciousness so you can transmit it to other vessels. But I don't think that's, I think that's just one part of this, right? Like when you're really calm and you're at peace, it's that part of your brain that wants to like play chess and argue, and that's something that gets quiet, So I think, and I think that's the main part that fears death. That little consciousness that's really hyperactive, and it can get a little control freaky. So I don't. I mean, I'm not trying to say I'm extremely brave, but I don't really fear death in the sense, because I think most of me doesn't fear death. What fears death is that little overly academic, active ego part, right? And if you can just let that thing relax,
Yeah,
and
chill the fuck out.
It's okay,
dude. Yeah,
yeah. The rest of us, I mean, don't you feel it? Your body, after a while, you're like, oh, I could rest. If death is rest, like I could. I mean, it's a lot of work being alive,
sure
right?
is,
Like
yes.
making sure our kids are okay, trying to get money all the time, like in the form of a job or whatever. Like that, if you could imagine rest as a relaxation, a jump, like a transformation to something, maybe nothing, or maybe something else. But from a body level, I don't fear it. It's only when I really start, oh, what about my career? What about my children's future? That's important, right? Like I have to stay alive. I have to help. It's the sort of, we're back to control again. Like it's that part of you that really wants to control the way life goes and make sure everything's okay. If you can recognize that there's a whole lot else to you, I think, and maybe like you said, being out, like when you're out in the woods, you see as much death as you see life. More, I would say, right? Like you just, dead leaves everywhere and fungi falling over and rotting, and it's just, and it's not such a scary thing. So I guess in my most beautiful moments, death is not a big deal. I would be sad if I died tomorrow.
I would be quite sad if you died tomorrow too, Dan. Yeah.
Well, right. And I would be sad if you died tomorrow. Yeah. But, I mean, I guess that means I don't want to die tomorrow, but like, I think in the long run, death isn't maybe because I'm a biologist, it's not such a scary thing. I mean, do you fear death?
I'm thinking about that. Yeah. I mean, I love your response, and that I think I agree with that on many levels, and I'm trying to come to grips with that. And I know in philosophy, I mean, in Plato's Phaedo, which depicts the death of Socrates, and Socrates' position there is pretty famous, that humans should not fear death, and has a lot of reasons for that. And he's just basically trying to convince his friends who are there with him as he's about to die, because he has to drink the hemlock poison that the Athenian state compels him to do. It's like this poison execution where he drinks this. But Socrates is really cool with it. He's just ready for it. He has his own reasons for doing it, for not escaping. And he's just telling his friends, like, don't worry about it. Stop blithering. Stop. There's nothing to worry about here. Let's just enjoy our last time together. And so, I like that position of trying to calm the fear of death. But at the same time, I see how maybe exactly for the reasons you pointed out, because there's a part of us humans. What that part is hard to define, but there's a part of us that really, really is allergic to the idea of going away. So maybe there's like that fear is natural or unavoidable on some level, but at the same time, maybe what philosophy can do, and maybe you've pointed to a way in which other disciplines, science and ecology, can do something similar to quell that fear or put it in context to quiet it and to reach something like a balance with it. So maybe that should be the goal. But I want to wrap it up now and move you, or ask you my last question, Dan, which is, so do you have 3 recommendations for us? Like, could you, Dan, recommend for us 3 items of media, either a book, film, or album that you could recommend for the audience? Oh no, just off the top of your head's good too.
I really like do you know David
Yes,
Graeber?
the recently deceased anthropologist, right?
Yeah, I really loved his book. So I'm just looking it up again on my other computer here. The Dawn of Everything: A New History of Humanity. So it's Wingrove and Graeber.
No, not yet. I've just seen excerpts.
Check it out. It's that would be my first recommendation. I think that's a really important book and the reason is that it's I think that he makes the point that most of history is just people living their lives, not great leaders, not great wars, not great pyramids being built or skyscrapers being built, although that's part of it. But and it really gives a lot of the value back to just how amazing humans are on their day to day, and how we interact with each other, and he kind of brings us back. Like, I think it's really important it gives you a connection to humans all through history, that they're maybe not as different as we think they were, that maybe we can relate to them. So I really like that book. Other books, books or other podcasts. Oh, I don't know.
Yeah, maybe
dude.
an
I'm
album.
kind
You
of
know, I know
blanking right now.
you've mentioned being a hippie before. What does that mean for you in terms of music? Does it mean anything? Yeah.
Oh, well, lately I've really been going back to the basics on bluegrass, you know, like Earl Scruggs and those guys, and the early, like the Grand Ole Opry stuff from the 40s and 50s. You know, Bill Monroe, Bluegrass Boys. I've been I think that's because I always found bluegrass really hard to listen to. Honestly, it was super cool. I mean, everybody was listening to bluegrass for a while, at least 10 years ago when I was still in the States. But I've come to a new appreciation of it. I think as I learned to play more banjo, I picked up the banjo, and I've been really focusing on that. And I think it's like jazz. It's like a music that's easier to really listen to and actually like if you can participate.
Sure.
Right. If you can jam, then all that stuff comes to life. Right. And so I've really been checking out a lot of the early bluegrass folks like Ralph Stanley and those guys. Yeah, I find a lot of excitement. It's music that gets me pumped, and peace. And it sounds, I think because I play, I can understand it better. It's like learning another language. It's a lot more sophisticated than I thought. Bluegrass, you know, it has this like air of like country, like redneck hillbilly music, but you get into it and it's like, wow, this is advanced stuff. This is just super, super complex. A lot of emotion, a lot of action. Like so. Yeah, I mean, maybe check out the early Scruggs, Monroe,
Sounds
bluegrass.
Perfect.
And then a third, let me see. I just read a book that was really good about fungi for the non-fungal people who want to learn about, let's see.
For the non-fungal, for the fungal novice.
Oh yeah. Yeah, for the novice. If you want to get into fungi and you want to learn more about how they really are super everywhere and important, it's called The Entangled Life. I don't know if you've seen that. It's by Merlin Sheldrake. Merlin Sheldrake, and the book is The Entangled Life. And it's a really great introduction to the biology of fungi, also how crazy they are. So it has some of the more extreme examples of what fungi do, including like potentially radiation harvesting for energy, things like that, things that are really edgy and new, but it also gives you the basics. And it also has some human aspects, like really delves into the lives of people who deal with fungi. So, yeah. So that would be my third item. Check out The Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dan. I'll try to throw links to each of those into the show notes for folks as well. So, but as we go out here, I'll imagine you with your banjo, sitting on a big mushroom in the forest there, enjoying your peace and your balance. So.
Why don't we?
That's right. Next time I come out there, I'll bring that guy. We just got to find a mushroom big enough. So that'll be your job before.
I mean, if your viewers don't know, David's a hell of a
I can hold my
player,
own, but so. Yeah, exactly. We have similar enough genres. So I'll dabble in some bluegrass as well. So, all right. Well, Daniel Thomas, thanks so much for joining us. Dan, my buddy, thanks a lot. And we'll talk to you soon. And everybody else, we'll see you at the next episode.
The Deadbeat Philosophy Podcast.
We hope you enjoyed this conversation with
Dan Thomas.
The Deadbeat Philosophy Podcast is a co-production of Deadbeat Media and the Museum Hegel-Haus, Stuttgart. For more Deadbeat content and to chip in to keep the channel going, check us out at deadbeatphilosophy.substack.com. For more about the Museum Hegel-Haus, check out hegelhaus.de. That's HEGEL-HAUS.de. Adios and auf Wiedersehen.